So today, we're hearing from one of our own faculty, Professor Jacob Bauer. Jacob is a recognized expert on effective altruism, recently contracted to write a book on the subject for Polity Press. He's also published on his own and with our colleague, Dr. Daniel Chun, on the ethical thought of Gandhi. He is an accomplished and widely beloved teacher. He's offered no fewer than 9 different courses in our department as well as for the core program. Finally, he's the founder and manager of Philosopher Games, a public philosophy social media project with over 165,000 followers across multiple platforms. I don't think anything I've ever said, done, written has reached a fraction of that many people ever. So Jacob's presentation today is entitled Climate Change and Effective Altruism, 4 Ways to Make a Difference. So he's going to talk for a while and then we'll have some Q&A and discussion.
Thanks.
Jacob?
All right, yeah, so the origin of this presentation actually developed for the 3rd-year core program initially, and now it's turning into a chapter of a book. And so there's the main goal for it is to introduce the movement of effective altruism through their work currently on climate change. And as the flyer suggested, we'll also get to some 4 main categories that they suggest of ways that we can make a difference on this particular topic. But the sub-topic is it's also present in a lot of effective altruism communication, is that we have power, like we have agency to do things about big issues such as climate change. And that's really counter to a lot of the narratives that we get on things like climate change, but many other topics, right? I think you might have heard the term Doomerism before. And there's studies on current Generation Z, on their views on climate. And the majority of them are somewhere on the doomer spectrum, in the sense that in some way we're doomed, so why do anything about it? And there's no doubt we're currently facing catastrophes due to climate change, and we will continue to face increasingly worse ones in the future. However, there's some good news, and the good news is that what we have done before, previously up to this point, has made a difference, and what we continue to do will also make a difference. I wanted to bring up a recent article real quick on this topic by Hannah Ritchie, who's kind of within the effective altruism broad movement, and she wrote an article called Why We Need the Right Kind of Climate Optimism. She recently had a TED Talk and has a book coming out on this next year on the topic of what we can do about climate change. And she argues for what she calls optimistic changemakers rather than pessimistic doomers. But on this chart we have, and so optimism, pessimism, and then whether we think we can change the future or not change the future. And each of these she thinks is dangerous for a variety of reasons. The Doomerism approach is dangerous because, well, we're just accepting our fate, right? We're not doing anything and things will get worse. That's also the same risk for if you're optimistic, but also don't think that with the current things are in motion, there's nothing we can do about it. The future will be better, it all worked out fine. That's also dangerous because that's not true either. If we are complacent, it's going to get worse. But what about the pessimistic change makers? So there's some danger here too. So this idea is that we're doomed and need to take extreme action to protect ourselves. And it depends on what you mean by extreme action, I guess. But she warns against this in the following way. Says that extreme action can make things worse than doing nothing. An immediate boycott, for example, of fossil fuels would result in a humanitarian disaster because the world still overwhelmingly relies on them to meet everyday energy needs. It would sacrifice the well-being of some of the poorest people on the planet who need both growth and energy. And so pretty in line with a lot of effective altruism communication on a lot of different topics, including climate change, is for being optimistic change makers, that the future can be better if we work for it. And that's the approach that we're going to go over today, kind of looking at climate change, not from the pessimistic Doomerism lens, but try from an optimistic change maker lens. This isn't to ignore that catastrophes are here and are going to come in the future, but the idea is that we can do things to make the future better than the current trajectory. And so the overarching theme is that you are powerful. And in fact, one of the things that effective altruists like to point out is you're more likely to be not just powerful, but among the most powerful people on the planet. And by sitting in this room, you might be. It might not feel that way, especially if you keep up with current events. We very much feel powerless on these large issues that seem to wash over us. There's nothing we can do about it. But there are many different ways that when we think in a global context, we are among the most powerful people on the planet. First one, relating to being here at a university, is education. So it turns out that less than 7% of the world has a college degree. And even in the United States, if you thought about why it's controversial with the whole student debt forgiveness programs, and everybody I talk to is a big fan of it. Well, I'm in the university community where most people I know are either working on getting a degree or already have one. It turns out in the United States even, among adults 25 years or older, only a third of adults have a college degree. So just by being here, having a degree, or working on getting a degree, you're likely among the most educated people on the planet, but also in the United States. Now, these other ones are ways that were perhaps in the 1%. And the first one is wealth. So this is a common theme in effective altruism, is noting how wealthy people are in affluent countries. So the average income for those with a bachelor's degree is in early career is over $50,000, and mid-career is around $70,000, unless you go into education, right? But nonetheless, we have, thinking on a global scale, we are among the most affluent people on the planet. Compare this to half of the world, half of the planet makes less than $3,000. And this is adjusted for the purchasing power in the United States. So it's called international dollars, but they try to map out as closely as possible how much you can buy for this estimate. And unfortunately, hundreds of millions of people live in what's called extreme poverty, around $700 a year. Once again, adjusted for purchasing power in the United States. We'll look at a graph on this a little bit later. One thing we'll be very aware of by the end of this presentation, the effective altruists love graphs, and we'll get to explore some of that in a little bit. These ones we have pretty hard numbers on. Obviously, there's always some estimates going on with each of those. These are a bit more hand-wavy, but I think there's a good case to be made that by being in this room, we're also in the 1% of influence. Once again, it doesn't feel like it, right? Because how can I influence the government? How can I influence the large policies that are influencing our everyday decisions on climate change? Well, once again, thinking globally, we live in a democracy. Now, there's a discussion of how much of a democracy we live in, right? But the reality is we have a lot more political power than most people in the world. You, likely, by being in this room, have influence over the most powerful politicians, governments, and media, more so than 99 out of 100 people in the world. Because we have one of the most powerful governments, medias, and politicians in the world. And it's within your realm of possibility to go to a town hall and actually have your voice heard to policymakers that are making huge decisions in the world. And then the fourth way that we can effective altruists often highlight that we are among the most powerful people in the world, one of our superpowers, is opportunity. So we have access to the highest impact careers, organizations, and resources in the world as well. We'll get into each one of these things a little bit later on, but this kind of helps contextualize the viewpoint, the framework that effective altruists come from, that we have the ability to make a difference in a variety of ways, and there's very much a different view of the world than the standard model of where, well, things are hopeless and we just got to deal with it. Effective altruism is a community that was inspired and co-founded by philosophers. So you could define it as a philosophical and social movement and community that aims to find the best ways to help others and put them into practice. Now, in terms of philosophy, usually we consider anything that's happened in the past 100 years or so as cutting edge. So this term was only coined around a little over 10 years ago in 2011. So this is very much a movement within the philosophy that's in its infancy. That being said, it started off with around 3 organizations at this time, now has over 300 organizations, and has helped channel billions of dollars to high-impact charities. Some of the early founders and most notable thought leaders in this community are the philosophers William McCaskill and Toby Ord, both philosophers at the Oxford University. And if you're interested, I wouldn't be a good academic if I'm not plugging books at you all. You can actually get some of their works for free through effectivealtruism.org. You can either digital or physical copies. The general framework that effective altruists work from and they promote is sometimes called the INT framework, but the way that we'll discuss it today, I'm calling it the SNS framework. It goes by many different names, but it's the same basic framework in each case. So the first thing to consider is scale, or also sometimes called importance. How big or significant is the problem? Next, neglectedness. How much attention and resources are currently being directed to the problem? Sometimes it's also called crowdedness. And then solvability. Will allocating additional resources, both in terms of money, but also your time, how will that affect the situation? Will it lead to new solutions? Will it expand current existing ones? This is also sometimes called tractability. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. I have a whole chapter on these concepts, but just to give you a sense of the general framework that effective altruists are working from. And based upon this, today, the main areas that they work on can be put into 3 main groups. The first one being extreme poverty. This is what they're most well known for. This is arguably the inspiration for the movement, which we'll look at within the next slide. And why? Well, think of the SNS framework: scale, neglectedness, solvability. It turns out this is a huge problem. It's a pretty awful problem. It's something that over 14,000 children die each day due to preventable causes related to extreme poverty. These are things that are preventable. We have cures for, easy, cheap cures. They're just not making it to these individuals, to these families across the globe. Giving you a little sneak peek on some graphics I'm developing for the book. This is equivalent to 27 jumbo jets crashing every single day full of children. And this, once again, these are people that don't need to die, that are dying from things that we have solved for a long time. Now, we have solutions, and they're cheap and easy solutions, and that's, once again, why it's kind of fits within this framework of things that we have power to combat. Another big one is animal welfare. Up to this point, it's mostly been focused on farm animals, but there has been in recent years some movements in looking at how can we improve the lives of wild animals, including the various ways that we're impacting those animals as well. Just a quick look at a graphic here to contextualize this. Farm animals, just counting land animals, over 80 billion are slaughtered each year, usually after living a life of intense suffering. To put this in context, there's around 8 billion people alive today, so that's this box here. And in terms of amount of human deaths per year, 0.06 billion or 60 million per year. So this is a huge scale issue. If you think animals matter at all, and you think that it's wrong to have needless suffering for our fellow animals, then this is a large issue that also has easy solutions, easy ways to address it. Now, the ones that we're going to focus on today fits into this last category, catastrophic risks. Now, it's pretty easy to see why this is a big issue, right? Because this is the planet. It's something that affects everybody, including humans, but in some cases, animals as well, and nature as a whole, as we know with climate change. Other big areas that effective altruists work here within this camp are pandemics. Before COVID-19, many effective altruists were raising alarms about our unpreparedness for pandemics. They still are, because that we aren't investing enough into preventing the next pandemic. Before ChatGPT and so on raised a lot of concerns for AI, for well over a decade, there's been raising alarms about those issues, and still are to this day. Nuclear war, obviously, another big one. Now, this is one that has had a lot, not quite as neglected as other topics, but it is becoming, it's much more neglected than it was 20 years ago, and we have much more risk of nuclear war, especially with our current relations with Russia. But the one that we're going to talk about today and focus on is climate change. And this is another one that, unlike these three, there's many ways that this can result in not just catastrophe, but also existential risk, wiping us all out. Climate change, there's some good news there, in that the current science suggests that we aren't headed towards extinction through climate change, but we are headed toward catastrophe. But nonetheless, climate change can not only has all the catastrophes related to it that we are aware of with extreme weather events, but also can increase the probability of other existential threats and also all the other major issues going on. If we have all these other catastrophes going on around us dealing with with climate change, it raises tensions and so on. All right, so one last kind of general overview of effective altruism concepts before we get directly into climate change is arguably the writing that inspired the movement. So effective altruism founded 2011 or so. The writing, which many of the philosophers in the room are going to be familiar with, that inspired the movement is Peter Singer's Famine, Affluence, and Morality back in the 1970s. So you might be familiar with this basic analogy, but if you imagine someone walking by a pond where there's a toddler drowning, and they could easily step in, save the child, but by doing so, you're going to get mud all over your shoes and over your pants. And so if you imagine the person just walking by, saying, you know what, not my kid, not my problem, and the child dies, I think we could all agree that would be a moral monster. That would be horrendous, terrible. Obviously, an awful thing to do. Well, why? Because you're prioritizing your stuff, your clothes for this over a human life. Now, there's all kinds of different interesting arguments, and in my ethics classes, we spend a whole day exploring these concepts related to this analogy and this writing. But we don't have to get onto all those nitty-gritty details to point to a basic fact that effective altruists take from this. And this is what's called positive ethics. And this is actually an alternate name that they were thinking about when they decided on the term effective altruism, was positive ethics, and to say that we have positive moral obligations to the world. That ethics is more than just thou shalt nots, things that we shouldn't do, negative obligations, but we also have positive obligations. That things, at least from time to time, such as in this example, we are morally obligated to make sacrifices, perhaps, but do things to save others or to at least stop bad things from happening. Now, going back to kind of the superpower example, this is something that's pretty common, or a common phrase among Marvel fans, at least, you might be familiar with from the Spider-Man franchise, is with great power, anybody? Exactly, comes great responsibility. So, I mean, if there's one takeaway here, is that, well, this person has the power to do something, right? Has a responsibility to do something with that power. And that's kind of the basic message for effective altruism. Now, there's, once again, if you're familiar with the arguments made in this writing, there's a lot of strong obligations made through that argument. But effective altruists generally just say, well, we don't have to go out that far. All we have to say is that we do have at least some obligation to some responsibility because of the power that we have in the world. And remember, we are powerful. We're not quite Spider-Man, but we have superpowers. We have things that we have ways that we can influence the world far more than the vast majority of individuals on the planet. Now, how do we use these superpowers? Well, surveying a variety of effective altruist writings and organizations, I've condensed them into the 4 ways, right? All right, so we're getting to the advertised promise of the 4 ways that things we can do to make a difference about climate change. Well, it's actually like thousands of ways, but we're going to categorize them in just 4. And we're going to look at the least impactful, but still impactful, and kind of work our way up. And the first one I think that everybody is curious about is like, what can we do individually in our lives? What ways can we change our lives in order to make a difference, lower our carbon footprint? Turns out there are big ways that we can lower our carbon footprint. Now, it turns out there's other ways that you could do even more about the environment, about climate change, including donating to high impact charities. Beyond that, high impact advocacy could potentially do even more than that. And then finally, if you are in the position to devote your career to this topic, to this issue, that potentially is the way that you can make the most impact on this. Now, how does that play out? Well, we'll go over each of these in a moment, but one thing I'll note, I like to call this the stack, so S-D-A-C, it's kind of like stack, because these stack on each other. It's not like you just need to focus on one, or these work in isolation. There is some intersection of how these things can play out. But let's take a look at lifestyle changes first. So the basic approach for effective altruism is trying to find what are the biggest ways that we can make a difference, right? And it's very data-oriented, and so this is where all the charts and graphs are coming in. So first, main advice that really carries over to almost every one of these points here is focus on the big stuff. It goes back to that S&S framework, the scale. Focus on the big ways that you can make a difference with your lifestyle changes. Well, what are those ways? Well, let's look at a chart. Let's look at some data. This here shows a variety of things. So one, it shows the more you make, the more you have, the more your carbon footprint increases. Well, kind of makes sense. You have more resources, you're buying more stuff, you're taking more flights, and so on. But another thing it shows us is, in general, where our household carbon footprint comes from. So you see the red is food, blue is housing, green, which is that small sliver there, clothing, the orange is yellow, transportation, gray is just everything else after that. Now, so first thing that I think the main reason that this was developed by the authors is that, well, if you just choose as you go up the income bracket not to buy as much stuff and not to use as much resources, that's one way that you could really curtail some of your carbon impact. Now, another thing that we can take away from here, though, for across the board, the general trend, no matter what income bracket that you're in, the 3 main things that you can look at main areas that you can reduce your personal carbon impact is 1, food, so it counts from anywhere from 16 to 20% of your carbon impact. Personal transportation, 17 to 30%. And home energy use, this is the biggest category, counts for around 1/3. Great, so here's some things that we can work on, but what do we do with that, right? These are still big topics. That doesn't really tell us much. Well, in terms of food, let's look at each one of them real quick and look at some more charts and graphs and see what we can glean from them. So for food, there's this great infograph by Hannah Ritchie again, posted back in 2020. There's a lot of information on this. It's actually, you could spend a whole class diving into each aspect of it. There's a lot going on here, but essentially what the graph is showing us is that, it's showing us is per kilogram of food, whatever it is, how much greenhouse gas emissions is needed to make that whatever kilogram of food. And just by looking at it, we can kind of see like, well, some things are far more impactful than others, right? But we also see it's color coded. So what's going on with the colors? It's showing you where those greenhouse gases are coming from. So we have packaging, retail, transportation. Those are the little tiny slivers over on the side here. So these little tiny slivers at the end. So there are some greenhouse gas associated with them, but overall those aren't the big things, right? What are the big things? Well, things like animal feed. Well, if you have to do a lot of resources to grow plants and then just to feed them to grow more food through animals, that's there are emissions tied with that. Also, just issues in terms of the farm practices themselves and land use change. But another thing that you can glean from this is like, all right, yeah, the top half is far bigger than the bottom half. Well, what's going on with the bottom half compared to the top half? Well, in general, there's exceptions to this, but top half compared to the bottom half, we have, well, there's a nice summary of it right here. So CO2 emissions from plant-based products are as much as 10 to 15 times lower than most animal-based products. Now, even if you look at things like milk, which is somewhat low on the list, we have soy milk that's lower, right? It turns out that plant-based food is a much more efficient energy transfer system. Is that we're taking sun through photosynthesis, we're creating energy out of it, then we're eating it and getting energy for ourselves. Well, with animal products, we have that same process, but then we feed that to other animals, which is then converted to eventually energy for us to eat, which that process means, well, it's going to be a lot more emissions. So if you want to just kind of get what is a way to reduce, well, I guess one other thing I wanted to read here is factors such as transportation, distance, retail, packaging, and are often small compared to just what food you eat. So you want an easy way to cut that huge block of our individual carbon emissions is eat less animal products. That's one easy way that you can shave a decent chunk off of your carbon footprint. Now, what about transportation? Well, we can look at another graph. We'll look at it a bit quickly, but you can kind of see what's going on here. So carbon cost of transportation, this is per kilometer. And so things like airplanes are pretty high up there, but what it's really bad is just our standard modes of travel. All right, this is working now. So things like a medium car. We don't even have the large cars that we see out looking out this window on this list. This was designed mainly for a European audience, why it's in grams and kilograms and things like that. But cars, not great, even if they're diesel cars. Whereas here at the bottom of the list, we have things like ferries, apparently, surprisingly, are fairly efficient. National rail systems, which I really wish we had more of here. Electric vehicles, and there's a lot of debate of, well, there's also emissions tied to this and environmental impact. That's true, but this is taking into account of a life cycle analysis. And if you want to get a really tiny 2-passenger car, hey, that's still almost twice as carbon, has almost twice the carbon footprint as electric vehicle, but at least it's better than nothing. So key things that you can, if you want to focus on the big stuff for your transportation, well, let's reduce travel miles, because one thing some people have noticed when I bring this up to my students, they say, hey, look, short haul flights are the worst, so we might as well go on the long haul flights. Well, this is by mile or by kilometer, right? So sure, if you're like, hey, instead of going to California, I'm going to go to Italy because, hey, short-term or long-haul flights are more efficient than short-term. Well, now you've actually made it worse because sure, per mile, per kilometer, it's more efficient. Now you're doing a lot more miles with it. Also change travel methods. In general, so asking questions like, do I really need to go on this travel? And if I am going to, how is it possible to take a more efficient method? Now, sometimes, if you are going to a conference across the pond, as they say, well, you can't swim there, right? But we could look at when you do have agency on it, obviously, biking or walking is best. Planes and standard cars are not great. And then finally, the home energy sector, same deal. All right, well, how do we figure out what we should do there? Well, let's look at the data. Where does our energy consumption come from? On average, so this is kind of, it notes that depending on where you live or what type of house you have, you're gonna have different energy requirements. But in general, the big things, scroll down here. Essentially, the way that we use our energy, the bulk of our carbon footprint comes from heating stuff up or cooling things down. Most of it is heating stuff up. It turns out it takes a lot of energy to heat up water and air. And it does take a lot of energy to cool things down too, but we have more efficient methods to do that with heat pumps, which increasingly we're now using for heat generation as well. But yeah, so the big things, I guess another thing to note here is just how small lighting is. And this is something that surprised me when I first learned about it. So that's this one here, the kind of the pink one. And how much emphasis there is on turning the lights off as you leave the room, which you should do. Please keep doing it, right? But even if you're decided to live in the dark, never use lights ever again, and only work with daylight, you can't switch to things like candlelight because that's even worse for the environment. But if you decide never to use lights again, all right, well, you've only shaved at most, what here, 7%? Great, please keep turning off your lights when you leave the room. But if that's the main way that you choose that you're going to make an impact on your carbon emissions, you're not actually doing much. So instead, use your moral energy on the big stuff. Things like reducing perhaps heater and AC use, just turning the AC down or up rather, having your thermostat set higher during the summer and lower during the winter. So keep it warmer in the summer, cooler in the winter. That can shave some percentage points off. But really the big things are having more efficient systems built into your home. Things like if upgrading your decades-old water heater or using heat pumps rather than incorporating that into your HVAC system, and especially upgrading your insulation. And of course, perhaps also adding things like solar panels. But these are very expensive things to do, especially if you're looking for a contractor these days, right? But still, if you want to reduce that 30% down by a lot, these are some of the focusing on those big aspects are ways to do that. One of the dangers, though, with lifestyle changes is that sometimes it can lead to us fixating on the small things like the light switches and so on, and then using up kind of all of our moral energy on that, and then neglecting the big things. And this in psychology is sometimes known as moral licensing. So this is a common thing that effective altruists warn against, is that if you really are hyperfixated on the small things, whether it's climate change or other areas, that means you're probably going to drop the ball, or you're more likely to drop the ball on bigger things. So people who perform one good action, there's some studies that back this up, that people tend to compensate by doing fewer good actions in the future, which is a weird thing. But I don't know, maybe if you reflect on it, you only have so much energy, right? You only have so much moral energy to fight things. And so focusing on low impact things might result in making fewer good choices on the high impact things. And as a result, could be net harmful as a result. One example I sometimes give here, so maybe you feel really good about yourself, like, man, all week long, I always turned off the lights before I left the room. I'm gonna treat myself with a nice juicy burger. Well, probably just undid all that good work you did by the end of the week. All right, so one other thing before we move past lifestyle changes is another danger, is that kind of sweating the small stuff. Well, lifestyle changes might be those small stuff. I think in general, effective altruists will say we should live as we live in the way that is in line with our values. But if we hyperfixate on just lifestyle changes, this is just a small sliver of the impact that you could be doing on this topic. And to get a sense of this, imagine that you are able to cut your annual greenhouse gas emissions in half. Well, in the United States, on any given year, on average, each of us is responsible for around 18 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, compared to the world, so once again, let's say we're doing really good, we've worked on that list, cut our emissions in half. Well, we're now still above average for the world. On average in the world, it's around 7 tons. And the target that we need to get to for a sustainable level is around 2 tons. So lifestyle changes are good, things we need to incorporate in our lives, but perhaps isn't the thing that we need to focus on the most. Perhaps we need to devote more energy on other aspects. Well, what else could we do? Well, this is the next step along the ladder is donating to high impact charities. Now, this is what effective altruism is known for, especially in the area of extreme poverty, but the same thing plays out here and for climate change charities as well. And some suggestions that effective altruists give here is note that not all charities are equal. Not all charities are even beneficial. Some of them, unfortunately, do harm. And some charities are far better than the average ones. And so same basic suggestion, focus on the big stuff, focus on the ones that are making the most impact. And if you focus on the big areas of the best charities, you don't have to be a billionaire to actually make a tangible difference. So this is going back to that superpower of our wealth, right? So this is a graph of global income inequality is extreme. So if you look down here, this is the bottom half of the people on their planet kind of stack their cash up. This is what it would look in relation to the upper half. And most people in this room either are now or will be on this skyrocket portion, being among the most wealthy people in the world. So we have this power. What can we do with it? Well, okay, what charities then should we donate to? It's a complex question. So key questions that effective altruists bring up here include, so this is from William McCaskill's Doing Good Better book on this topic. What does a charity do? How cost effective is it? How robust is the evidence behind it? How well is it implemented? Does it need additional funds? And you probably could add many more, but see, there's some of the key questions. Now, this is a lot to take in. Who has the time for that, right? Well, one of the big things that effective altruists have been working on the past 10 or so years is building up organizations that do this for us, that do some of the heavy work of doing answering the hard questions, evaluating evidence, including sometimes commissioning randomized control trials and things like that. And two big organizations from the effective altruist movement that work on this topic are more recently Given Green, I think started around 2020. Founders Pledge works on a lot of research on a lot of different topics, but one of the topics they focus on is climate change. They've been around for a little bit longer. So what do they recommend? Well, let's look at two categories. One is the big buzzword that has been around. There's been a lot of articles the past couple years on bogus carbon credits. So things like carbon offsets and removals that you could pay to offset your 18 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. But it turns out in many of those cases, they just either are well-intentioned, but their mechanisms don't work, or just really nefarious and just trying to get money from you because profiting off your desire to want to do good for the world. And unfortunately, that is the reality that we live in today. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ones that do what they say they do. There are some that do to what they say they do. But there's also these dangers where there are some airlines, for example, say, hey, pay extra 10% and you'll be able to offset your emissions for this flight. And well, you might feel good about that and maybe fly more often. Moral licensing comes back into play here as well. Now, if you wanted to look at, so one of the things that Given Green does is evaluate charities, and not, in this case, actually companies that offer these services and say, all right, which ones are actually doing what they say they do? Now, in terms of carbon removal, there are some that are doing what they say they do, but it's very expensive. It ranges from $160 per ton. So I think you've got to multiply that by 18 to get the average amount of taking to offset your carbon emissions to $1,200 per ton. They still recommend these because you kind of see that as an investment. As they get more money, they can scale up and those numbers will come down. But other ones that, if you want to do this process, this is currently pretty expensive, but something that's cheaper is offsetting. So there's a couple organizations that they've vetted here. One that makes sure they find old canisters of greenhouse gases, that CFCs and refrigerants that are thousands of times more potent than carbon, and dispose of them. And this Burn one here, they sell carbon credits at $18 per ton, and they vetted it and was like, yeah, that sounds about right. But this one's pretty interesting. So this one, they provide more efficient stoves to places in extreme poverty, especially in Africa. And this is kind of a win-win-win. By doing so, they no longer are using open fire pits that are really release lots of emissions, but it's healthier for them as well. And they estimated the cost effectiveness was actually closer. They sell it for $30 per ton, and they, based on a randomized control trial, said it might actually be as low as $5 per ton. There, it's starting to get a bit more affordable to offset your carbon emissions, not just become net neutral. Well, you might be able to become net negative. But interestingly enough, none of these make their top giving recommendations. Instead, the ones that make their top giving recommendations focus on systemic change, because we need more than just individual action. We need people to limit their carbon footprint. We need to change our culture so that we aren't using so much resources and that are donating and giving to places to offset, then build up these systems that help address the issue. But we need systemic change to make a real impact. And so there's many organizations that say they're doing this. What are the ones that actually seem to be putting up results? If you focus on those, it might be less than $1 per ton in terms of the removing, or what you should expect that the amount of money that they use in terms of the carbon, in many cases, what policies end up resulting in less greenhouse gases ending up in the atmosphere. To give an example, Founders Pledge in 2018 did a deep dive on Clean Air Task Force, who the description of this is a government, here. So Clean Air Task Force has an impressive track record shaping and ensuring the passage of large-scale policies and agreements such as Inflation Reduction Act from last year and the Global Methane Pledge, as well as continually supporting the global scale-up of emerging technologies such as carbon capture and zero-carbon liquid fuels. And so they just look at their past successes based upon the amount of money resources that they had. And it looks like it was only around $1.26, and just based off of per ton prevented of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And in terms of what they're working on in the future, they expect it to be a lot less than that. One other note here is that these lists change. So these are each year they reevaluate and look at the new organizations that are coming online, and also looking at older organizations and reassess and see if whether they should be on the top recommended list or not. If you want to give, but you don't want to have to keep updating every year, they also have expert managed funds where basically each year your money will be going towards what they're recommended charities, and so you don't have to keep updating it every year from year. All right, so the last two categories are in terms of ways that you could perhaps potentially do more good on these topics than high impact donations and lifestyle changes. The next one is advocacy. So the basic idea here is taking what we've already done and learned so far and having a multiplier effect. And so what's better than one person taking action or donating high impact charities and so on? Multiple people taking action, right? So if you convince one other person to take action, we're used to this idea, well then you've now doubled your impact. And so this is a way to scale the things that are having a meaningful impact on the world. Many different ways that this take form, from education here, like the university system, activism, lending your voice to add pressure to political corporations, politicians and corporations rather, building advocacy groups and clubs. And there's actually a lot of work among effective altruists trying to quantify our power to vote. And it turns out like our votes are actually very valuable, but also getting other people to vote and influencing votes is also a very valuable thing as well. And just like a note on this, that climate change was created through collective action, right? Collective action of billions of people over decades and centuries at this point. Well, primarily the past 100 years, but it's going to take the collective action of billions of people to combat it. But we're on our way to doing it. A couple of things on advocacy. This has a wide range, like has the potential to be more impactful than those previous two categories. It also has the potential to be a lot worse. So if there's a danger in poor information or misinformation on these topics. And so I put it on the two of higher than the other ones because it has this higher potential. but they're also, potentially, it can have a worse outcome as well. All right, so the number one way that you could potentially make a difference on climate change is through your career. And so in terms of the effective altruism community, there's an organization called 80,000 Hours. They're called 80,000 Hours because, we can use this graph to illustrate this. So maybe we can try to zoom in here. So this here, all these are little dots. There's 80,000 of them, and they're representing each year of your life that you devote to your career. So on average, the average individual spends 80,000 hours devoted to their career. Now, if you could make your career just 1% more impactful or 1% more enjoyable, or then it would be worth spending 1% of your career or time that you would be devoting to your career to figuring out on how to do so, which would mean months of just dedicated time thinking about your career and ways to improve it. Now, fortunately, one of the earliest organizations in the effective altruism movement, started by one of those philosophers at the earlier pages, Will MacAskill, but also Benjamin Todd. It's called 80,000 Hours, and they have a whole wealth of resources they've developed over the past 10 years, well, 10 plus years at this point, to help give advice on that. And they actually just re-released one of their books just this past month, hot off the presses, on their career guide, and giving a lot of advice, not just on climate change, but just social issues in general. And some of the key questions here are things like, what's your personal fit? So not everybody has a personal fit to be a climate scientist, right? Or a activist. So you have to look at, well, some people might call this your vocation. Think about where does your personal strengths and weaknesses, how can you use those for whatever the particular topic is? And then in terms of picking your initial career or job, perhaps if you're picking from job offers, you can think of, well, what would be your impact in each one of those things? But you could also then ask, well, what's the long-term impact through this as well? So you might choose a gateway job or gateway to build skills, and then say, well, this isn't making a whole lot of impact right now, but it can lead to better opportunities in the future. This brings us back to the very beginning, to that SNS framework: scale, neglectedness, solvability. In terms of with your career, you can ask those same questions. How good would you be if you're successful in this career? How much work has already been done here? Or is this already plenty of people working on it? This is sometimes called, where's the low-hanging fruit, right? If there are a lot of people already working on this, one extra person isn't going to do as much good compared to places where there's not a whole lot of people working on it. And then how likely do you think you'll be able to make a dent in this particular area? Some suggestions that 80,000 Hours gives is potentially, if you really want to devote your career to this, look at green tech innovation, carbon removal tech, research, especially looking at the big issues for climate change. But as we mentioned before, things like policy, coordination, prioritization, but also support roles. Like all the big players in these things, they need people to help them out. And they actually manage a jobs board. And so this is just from earlier today. We have new jobs going on there every day, and you can put on filters for what area you want to work on. So this is the filters for climate change. So plenty of jobs available. That's another way that potentially you could be using those 80,000 hours of your life to do your most precious resource, spend your time to work on this or protect perhaps other cause areas as well. So just a quick recap before we get to Q&A. So the basic idea for effective altruism is positive ethics, saying that we have agency, we have power, we can make a difference, and we have a variety of superpowers to work with. And what can we do with them? Well, there's a lot of things, right? But they stack together, right? So you can make lifestyle changes and make a decent dent on your carbon footprint. But finding the right charities to donate to could make a further impact where you might be net negative in that sense. But really, we need systemic change, which leads to what those organizations that they suggest donating to, but also things like advocacy, and then things like using your career to make a difference. A couple things just before we move on to that I want to point out before we move on to Q&A. One, going off that positive, right, optimistic changemakers view, that there are solutions. This is in terms of those cause areas that are brought up earlier. this is one that perhaps we have some of the clearest avenues for success here. The good news is that we have clear trajectories that we can follow. The IPCC gives us a lot of data on what policies that we should strive for. And collective effort is actually making a difference, believe it or not. So real quick, it wouldn't be effective altruism presentation without some more graphs. It turns out our CO2 emissions in the United States and European Union, they're going down. Like, we actually have done work here. And now, as a globe, they're still going up. But actually, on per person, they have leveled off. They're going up now because of population growth. We are actually making a dent. If we didn't have all the movement building and all of the work that we've done up to this point, we wouldn't be seeing graphs like this. And we wouldn't have had things like the IRA. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act last year, but it's really kind of the climate bill. And this was unimaginable 10 years ago, right? Even under Obama, we just couldn't pass such legislation. But yet, billions of dollars are now devoted to this issue, which is expected to block around 5 million tons of carbon equivalent emissions. So we are making a difference. There are things that we can do. And just real quick, couple other things. Being at a Catholic university, there's effective altruism is often thought of as a secular movement, and it is for the most part, but there is a Christian branch of it. And I got to meet one of the researchers for this group, Effective Altruism for Christians, focusing, the way he described it is that Christianity generally has the positive ethics part down, like wanting to do a good thing, but sometimes needs a little help with the actually making a difference part. And so there's a growing community of Christians on this topic within effective altruism. And then, of course, on campus, if you want to find something local to do, there's a sustainability club. I think the best place to get news for them right now is their Instagram, if you want to just check that out. But there's also their email, and there's a whole page on UD's website about it. All right, well, that's all I have for you. So why don't we move to a Q&A?